Voice Italia, Philadelphia.
Class is now in session. Christopher Columbus University is on air from Philadelphia and broadcasting worldwide from within the shadow of Marconi Plaza. Radio Voice Italia is proud to present a recurring segment with civil rights author, professional researcher, and renowned Christopher Columbus expert, Robert Felix Petrone, Esquire.
Buongiorno tutti and welcome to Radio Voice Italia's Christopher Columbus University, where we teach you the truth about the greatest hero of the 15th and 16th centuries, Christopher Columbus, and update you on the international efforts to preserve Christopher Columbus's legacy. I'm your host, il professore Robert Petrone. Today on our Christopher Columbus University segment, we have a very special episode of Christopher Columbus University for you. It's a holiday episode, a Father's Day episode. On today's episode, we're going to zoom in on that portion of the character sketch that I gave you in episode 4, lesson 4, to focus specifically on Christopher Columbus as a father and how that related to his many amazing deeds. So without further ado, let's get started on class number 8, Columbus, the Super Dad. The year was 1460. It's the port town of Genoa, one of the great focal points for seafaring mercantilism of the early Western world. The Apennine Mountains are to the north, the Mediterranean Sea is to the south. Marble palaces are dotting its hilly, narrow urban labyrinth and piercing the sky with statues and steeples. 9-year-old Cristoforo Colombo watches with wonder aside his uncle, Antonio, Genoa's lighthouse keeper. Not only as thousands of ships arrived from and disembarked for all regions of the known world, including the Middle and Far East, bringing oils, spices, silks, and other wonders, including sailors of nearly every race, creed, and color, but also now, 4 years after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, warships collecting crusaders to reclaim the Holy Land. All of this undoubtedly forged an imagination and longing for the sea in the young man as vast as the canopy of stars by which the sailors navigated. Young Cristoforo acquired a copy of Marco Polo's manuscript of his travels to Asia, which he not only assiduously read, but heavily annotated in his own hand. He also read the travels of Sir John Mandeville and the groundbreaking Imago Mundi by Pierre Dailly. In or about 1466, an adolescent Cristoforo Colombo ceased working for his father, Domenico, peddling wine and wool, to apprentice on merchant ships. Before long, ship captains began to notice him and signed him on for sojourns around the Italic Peninsula, unfurling sails, keeping lookout, and loading the heavy cargo. In 1472, now a young man of 21, Captain Cristoforo Colombo ceased doing that, and he received a commission from the King of Anjou to capture a large galley off the coast of Tunis. A few years later, the Spinola firm sent him on several mercantile missions, one of which ended in a conflict with French privateers, which he survived only by leaping off of his sinking ship and swimming 2 leagues, that's 7 miles, to the Portuguese coast, where he discovered a Genoese community in Lisbon, where he learned to speak Castilian Spanish. Thereafter, he sailed to England, Ireland, and Thule in the far north, and back again to the remote Portuguese-held island of Madeira, bringing him further out into the open sea with the Portuguese sailors than he had ever sailed in his life. After a brief return to his hometown of Genoa to settle some business in court, he returned with his younger brother, Bartolomeo, to Lisbon, Portugal in about 1479. One Sunday, young Cristoforo Colombo attended Mass at Lisbon's Convento dos Santos, where a 19-year-old Portuguese noblewoman of Italian descent, Dona Felipa Perestrello, daughter of the late mariner Don Bartolomeo Perestrello, noticed his attentions. In the biography of Christopher Columbus entitled The Life of the Admiral, written by Columbus's younger son, Fernando writes, quote, "He behaved very honorably and was a man of such fine presence, and withal so honest, that she held such conversation with him and enjoyed such friendship with him that she became his wife." End quote. The newlyweds left the home of the bride's mother and moved to the Portuguese island of Porto Santo. In the following year, Christopher Columbus's first son was born, whom he named Diego, Castilian for James, or it could also be translated as Jacob. Tragically, however, Felipe died in childbirth. The biographer, Columbus's second son, Fernando, apologizes very touchingly for his scant knowledge of the details of the courtship and brief marriage of his father and Felipe. He writes of his father, quote, "He died before I made so bold as to ask him about such things, or to speak more truly, at the time such ideas were farthest from my boyish mind." How some things never change. Sorry, I'm getting choked up. Listeners, I'm recording this only a few days before Father's Day. If you are one of the lucky few to have a father who is still with us, do yourself a favor. When the show is over, call him up, wish him a happy Father's Day, tell him you love him, and ask him something about his life that you don't know. And if, like the rest of us, your father is no longer with us, wish him the same anyway. All right, where were we? So, Porto Santo, Portugal. Christopher Columbus was now a single father of a motherless baby in a foreign country. He turned to God for help, going to confession and communion often and spending much time with the Franciscan monks on the island. Somehow, with no wife and no money, because Columbus was bankrupted by having to provide a funeral for his wife befitting a noblewoman, he managed to not only support that baby, but get him fed, changed, potty trained, and walking. Christopher Columbus was a super dad. All the while, Columbus still longed for the sea. He listened to the tales of the deep seafaring Portuguese mariners of lands far to the west, which many considered to be the ravings of sea-mad sailors. But Columbus believed. During his visits with the Franciscans, he read in their library and discussed with them a great transformative theory he wished to test. A plan to find an all-water route to Asia across the Atlantic Ocean. When little Diego was about 4 years old, Christopher Columbus met with the King of Portugal, João, or John II, presented the king with all his maps, charts, writings, and sources, and made the pitch of his life. Would the Crown of Portugal fund a science experiment to find an all-water route to the Far East, and thus revolutionize trade and culture for millennia to come? The treacherous King João told Columbus he'd think about it, and then promptly delivered Columbus's maps, charts, and writings to his own fleet, and had them leave without Columbus. In a masterstroke of poetic and perhaps divine justice, a devastating sea storm crippled the Portuguese fleet and sent them listing back to port, whereupon Columbus discovered the duplicity, took his maps, charts, and journals, and turned his back on Portugal. He collected his effects, and his brother Bartolomeo took his toddler son Diego into his arms and bid farewell to Porto Santo. For nearly a decade of his, Bartolomeo's, and young Diego's lives, they pounded the proverbial pavements of Europe, sending Bartolomeo to England to make the same pitch to King Henry VII. With little Diego in tow, Cristoforo returned to Genoa, seeking patronage from his own people. But they dared not jeopardize their monopoly over the Mediterranean trade routes with the discovery of a new trade route that would cut out the Mediterranean routes to the Silk Road altogether. In the summer of 1485, Cristoforo and now 5-year-old Diego arrived in Castile, the queen of which, Isabella, whose late brother had just bequeathed her the kingdom of Leon, had just married King Ferdinand of Aragon, uniting a now tripartite empire. Spain, now a superpower, was ready to finally liberate itself from the oppression of the Moorish jihadists who had been murdering, raping, and enslaving Europeans for 700 years. By coincidence, Columbus's sister-in-law, the sister of little Diego's mother, Felipa, a noble woman by the name of Doña Violante Moniz, lived with her husband, Don Miguel Moliart, in Moguer, Spain, a short distance from the Spanish port town at which Columbus had landed. Did Christopher Columbus leave little Diego with the boy's aunt to become an absent father off pursuing his madcap vision? No. Columbus walked with and carried little Diego 7 kilometers to the Franciscan monastery of La Rábida, where Samuel Eliot Morison writes in his multi-volume Columbus biography, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Columbus, quote, asked the porter to give him bread and a drink of water for that little boy who was his son. There they acquired room and board, and Columbus was able to procure Catholic schooling for Diego. While living with the monks, he revealed to them his proposal for his world-changing science experiment. Head of the Franciscans, Father Antonio Marchena, believed and introduced him to a duke, who introduced him to another duke, who wrote a letter to the crown. And within 1 year, Cristobal Colombo, as they initially called him, rendering his given name in Spanish, but still retaining that Italian surname, was granted an audience by Queen Isabella herself in her court in Cordoba. Columbus spent 8 years of his life waiting for the monarchs to return to Cordoba from Madrid, and then trying to convince the king and queen, who were much more concerned with their reclaiming of Europe, the Reconquista, to bring the privy purse to find money for such a perilous and risky expedition. But in Cordoba, Columbus befriended and held erudite colloquies with the Muslim scholar Ibn Rushdi and the Jewish scholar Moses Maimonides, and other intellectuals of the royal city, such as Diego de Arana. In those 8 years, Columbus managed to win over a few allies in the court of Spain. He acquired a position for the growing Diego as a page in Isabella's court to her son, Prince John. Columbus impressed the Cardinal of Spain with his, quote, fair speech and learning and good intelligence and great knowledge. But most of all, the handsome, widowed, single father who was, as his filial biographer wrote of him, a, quote, well-built man of more than medium stature, long-visaged with some high cheekbones and hair of reddish hue that had turned white by his 30th year. He had met and won the heart of a lovely Spanish noblewoman named Beatriz Enriquez de Arana, cousin of Columbus's intellectual friend Diego de Arana. No record of an official marriage exists, perhaps because she was a noblewoman and Columbus was not a noble. He learned his lesson after being bankrupted from having to give a noble's funeral to his first wife. But on August 15, 1488, Beatriz gave birth to Columbus's second son, whom they named after the King of Spain, Ferdinand. Because of little Fernando's out-of-recorded wedlock birth, the petition for Christopher Columbus's sainthood, made by the First Vatican Council on June 29, 1868, was denied. But Beatriz and Christopher Columbus loved each other, and her family accepted him into it. And so, Christopher finally acquired for his now 2 boys the love, warmth, and security of a nuclear family for which his Catholic faith so strongly advocated. All the while, Columbus enjoyed frequent audiences with the crown. Queen Isabella seemed even to be captivated by his charms, though he forever remained chaste and faithful to Beatriz. He eventually acquired for the growing Fernando a position as page for Prince John alongside Fernando's older brother Diego. After young Prince John's death, the boys would eventually go on to become pages for the Queen herself. As pressures mounted from the jihadists, including direct threats to Queen Isabella by Sultan Abu al-Nasr Saif ad-Din al-Ashraf Qaitbay of Egypt and Syria, Columbus tried a different persuasive tack, suggesting to the crown an alliance with the great Khan of the Indies, whose legendary army could help crush the jihadists and liberate not only the rest of Europe, but Jerusalem. It worked. Though the keeper of the privy purse and all the king's men counseled against it and rejected Columbus's proposal, Queen Isabella reconsidered, personally called him back, and agreed to fund the expedition. On August 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus kissed his beloved, beautiful, blended family goodbye, leaving his boys in the care of Fernando's mother and Diego's new stepmom, Beatriz, whose kind caretaking Queen Isabella would later praise. On Columbus's first voyage, Beatriz's cousin, Diego, sailed in the 3-ship flotilla comprising the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria. On that voyage, Columbus met his best friend in the New World, Taino chieftain Guacanagari. Guacanagari so came to love Columbus as to be, quote, proud to call him and treat him as a brother, end quote. On Columbus's second voyage, Guacanagari was murdered by a rival tribe, likely in the service of the cannibal High King Caonabo, who was in the midst of a campaign of genocide against the other tribes of the Caribbean when the Europeans arrived and put a stop to that. Christopher Columbus adopted his late best friend's son, Guaycan, and raised the boy as his own. Now, let me repeat that to you, listeners. Christopher Columbus had a full-blooded Taino son whom he loved and raised as his own. On Columbus's third voyage, Beatrice's elder brother Pedro sailed with the fleet. On Columbus's fourth and final voyage, young Fernando, now a boy of 13, sailed with his father. On May 1503, spring tides tossed the two remaining ships of Columbus's flotilla for over a month, stripping, destroying, and grounding them on the island of Jamaica. Though Christopher Columbus sent messengers to seek help from the new governor of Hispaniola, the malevolent and murderous Nicolás Obando, Obando let the crews languish on Jamaica for a year, hoping they would all perish. Columbus wrote of his son, Fernando, that the 13-year-old boy, quote, cheered the others and worked as hard as if he had been a sailor for 80 years, end quote. Fernando eventually returned to Spain with his father, who died there 5 years later and was given a hero's burial in a golden coffin in the Cathedral of Seville. As far as we know, Fernando never married or had children, but he did become a scholar in Spain and in 1571 wrote The Life of the Admiral, a biography of his father, which serves as one of the primary historical sources of not only Columbus's life, but of the settlement of the West Indies. In it, he wrote of his father's death, quote, and we can believe that of God's great goodness, he indeed received the admiral into his glory, into which may he lead us with him. Amen, end quote. Fernando inherited his father's library, which remains today in the Cathedral of Seville. 2 years after Christopher Columbus died, his first son, Diego, became governor of the Indies, an office first held by his father, and whom no one, not even Diego himself, could do nearly as well. But that's a story for another class, Columbus the Great Governor, which we'll get to in due time. Diego himself married King Ferdinand's cousin, Maria de Toledo y Rojas, and fathered several children by her, who themselves had several children, who had several children, and so the great line of Christopher Columbus continued. What became of Guacanagari's son, Guaycan, whom Christopher Columbus adopted, the primary sources do not clearly bear out. Secondary sources are confused at best, which is why any Columbus historian studies the primary sources, not just the secondary sources. But it seems Guaycan mastered Spanish as well as his native tongue, had sailed with Columbus on some of his voyages and served as an interpreter. He seems to have been baptized in Spain with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella standing up for him as his godparents. But there are two more children who would call Christopher Columbus father. The Americas. Christopher Columbus was not only the first civil rights activist of the Americas, as we have firmly established in previous episodes, in particular episode 3, but he was also the first founding father of the Americas, bringing to the New World the great legacy of Western culture, many of the tenets of which were already codified as early as the 1200s in Castile's Siete Partidas, Spain's analog to the Magna Carta, and more thoroughly developed later by the founding fathers of the United States in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and their other world-changing masterworks, what I like to call the great triad of Western culture: the legacy of Greco-Roman democracy and law, Judeo-Christian ethics and morals, and the tenet that all are equal in the eyes of their Creator. Happy Father's Day. And that's today's class. For more news, articles, and resources about Christopher Columbus as the first civil rights activist of the Americas, icon of Western culture, paragon of Catholic virtue, and greatest hero of the 15th and 16th centuries, visit preservecolumbus.us. That's Preserve Columbus, rendered as one word, .us. And post a little note of appreciation for our webmaster, Tom LaCosta. I'm il professore, Robert Petrone, A presto!
The Jersey Shore has fun and sun, sand and sea, and Radio Voice Italian.
This is Radio Voice Italia, USA.